Hello, everybody. While in the first part of the talk we discussed the neural modeling in general, how we can do neural modeling using the Nango framework, and we discussed the neural architecture, the functional architecture of the neural functioning for a speech production and speech perception model. But that's not the whole story. If we want to do neural modeling using a large scale model, we need to think about more than just about the architecture. In addition, we have to define the task. That means the world in which the speaker has to act. That means we have to define scenarios. That means the scenario in combination with the model. That means with the brain and the speech organs and the ears. So in combination of the scenario and the avatar, we get simulated behavior for our avatar, or let's say for our simulated test person, because the scenarios in case of our work are mainly speech screening tasks, but mainly medical speech screening tasks. So what I want to discuss in this part of the talk are three types of tasks. The first is simple picture naming, where we have a visual input and we have to interpret the visual input. And for example, if we see an object, we have to name that object, or we have to understand what that object is, and then to utter the name of that object. For example, we see a car, then we have to say, so this is a car. Word comprehension is done, so the word comprehension task is done in a form that you have auditory input and we have to understand what this word means. So, for example, if the word is cat, we have to name a superordinate term, which is the cat is an animal. The third task is just a repetition task, and at least a lower level task, because we just do a repetition of logatomes, of syllables. That means not of words, not of meaningful units. So all these things what I will discuss now are given in this paper here, which can be downloaded from the Frontiers in Computational Neuroscience website, and you get the link here from my website. So again, coming to the model. So what you see here with the uppercase letters and the underlines, I already told that in the last part of the talk. These items here are buffers in which we can get neural activation, here for concepts, here for lemmas, here for phonological forms. This or the perception pathway, the same on the production pathway. We have the cognitive component, the control component. And that's mainly important now. So during the perception pathway, we have the buffer for somatosensory perception, for auditory perception, and for visual perception. These are more or less input buffers. And we have the pathway buffers themselves, which is the phonological form buffer, the lemma form buffer, and the concept form buffer. The same we have on the production side. Concepts were passed to lemmas and were passed to phonological forms. And here the things go further. We can pass them, or we can generate from the phonological form, we can form the motor form, the premotor activation in the motor production buffer, and we can generate gestures from that. We will come to that in the last part of the talk. So the activations of all these buffers is given on the next slide. In addition, we have, I should mention that we have the cognitive processing, but we just show the cognitive input information, the concept the concepts activated at the input of the cognitive processing level and the concepts which are resulting from cognitive processing, which are and on the output side. In addition, we show the control, the input control information. There is a buffer for this information, and there is a neural buffer for the output control information. So now for the picture naming task. First of all, here we see the buffers again with their activation levels. Here we have the time scale, and here we see, for example, for the cognitive input, we see, okay, we have here an activation of the concept bread starting at this point in time and holding over the whole simulation. So at least in the first part, of this picture, we see the activation of the control buffers, of the input buffers on the perception side, which is auditory input and visual input. Then the cognition, the input and the output. And in the case of one task, we need a binding with a relation type. And now I go down. So we have some more buffers, which more or less mainly describe the pathways, the perception and production pathways. The concept level, on the production side, the concepts on the perception side, the lemma level on the production side, on the perception side, and the phonological level on the production side and on the perception side. And for the production side, we again, at last but not least, show the activity of the motor level. Okay, going up again to, or let's go to the processing again. So for to the architecture again. So for our visual, so the first task was just the naming task. We have a visual input here, which first of all in the first part of the task needs to be to be understood. So what do we see? That is activated then on the concept level. And then the second part of the task is just produce the word, utter the word of this concept. So we are going to this side and then utter the word. So we go back to our to the visualization of the activation of all of the buffers for this task. So first of all, in the control part, we have the priming. Because the task is well known for the subject, for the test subject, the test subject is already primed. That means for 100 milliseconds, the task is just see what is coming in visually in the visual input buffer and try to understand it. And then after a specific time period, if you have understood it, try to produce it. So that's all for the control concept. The input is given here. We have a visual input. I hope you can see that. So the visual input is that there is a picture of a bread, and we have to understand that. For that, we have to go down, because also I go in this picture again. The visual input needs to be understood on the highest level of the perception pathway. So I go up again, and that is done here. So directly after we have the visual input, the visual input really occurs here in form of a strong activation of this concept. So we go up again. Then this concept is given to the cognitive input buffer. It is at least not processed in this task. It is just a feed forward to the output of the cognition path given here. And then what's going on in the rest of this task is that it just is going down through the production pathway. So we have the concept level of the production is activated for that word. bread, then the lemma level is activated, and then the phonological level is activated, and last but not least, the motor level is activated. What we see is that it always takes a little time from activation to activation because we have the associative memories in between, which activate a lemma from the concept and which activate a phonological form from the lemma. What we see in addition here is, first of all, what we can see here is that the associative memories work quite well. So if we have a concept bread, we get the word bread on the lemma level, and we get the phonological term bread here, which is given here as a phonological transcription, and we get the motor term. So the associative memories work quite good. But in addition, we have these S-pointer networks on each level. That can be seen here, for example, on the perception, on the concept level, on the production and perception side. They interact with the mental lexicon, and we see that beside the word bread, we get a co-activation of a similar term, which here is in our lexical context, donut. The same happens on the phonological level. What we can see here is if we have the activation of bread, we get an activation of phonological similar syllables like bran or brass. So we get these co-activations, but it doesn't make any problems. We get the correct activation of the word bread at the motor level. So again, we started with a visual input, perceived the correct word, it was passed through the cognitive processing component, and it was produced here at this part. The control paths were more or less primed for this task, so had nothing to do at all. The model, the test person, was aware what it has to do. In some special cases, not in this experiment of the 2020 paper, but in earlier experiments, we evaluated rare cases. In that experiment, we as well did picture naming, but we did a picture naming for one item for about 400 times. And what we got were rare cases. And that is important because that gives us an idea that the realism of the model is quite good. What we saw in very few cases is, that if we have during the production pathway, we get in full activation of the word, here of the word be, it may happen, despite the fact that the associative memories work correct and all works correct, that in some special or in some very rare cases, we get no word activation or just a very, very unsatisfactory small word activation, which does not lead to more activation on the lower levels. So on the lemma level, we get some small activation, but this is not sufficient to activate more levels, like the phonological level or the motor levels. So for this, see a different publication from the year 2016. And yeah, going back to this. So why does this happen? The point is that these rare cases underline the neural character of the model. That means that neural spikes are statistic events and neural signals are noisy. So in some cases it may happen that an activation does not fully work. So at least this rare case would mean we have still a full activation here, but in some cases it may happen that the activation is not fully at this level, or It may this could occur at all the other levels as well, for all the other associative memories. Please keep in mind that each of these arrows represents an associative memory, transforming, for example, here concepts in lemmas, lemmas in phonological forms in motor forms, or the other way around here. So the second scenario I would like to talk about is word comprehension. Here we have no visual input, here we have an auditory input. And here we have a cognitive processing. The task is to name the superordinate term. So it is a cognitive task, including binding. I gave you the information in the talk before, in the video before, that in the case of getting a superordinate term, we need a binding operation on the neural level. So, and we will have a look in this. So now we get an auditory input, which goes through the perception pathway, phonological term, the lemma will be activated, the concept will be activated, and then at least it ends more or less at this level. We get a cognitive input, and here we do cognitive processing. We have to activate the superordinate term by a binding process, which is not shown here in detail. And this superordinate term, for example, in the case of cat, the word animal, then needs to be produced. Okay, let's have a look. The control component is the same, just a short priming, listen which word is auditorily presented, and think about the superordinate term, and then utter the superordinate term. So I will not stay very long with this. So yeah, first of all, let's go to the lower part of this figure. We here now get an input, the word apple on the perception side, on the lemma side activated, on the in the perception pathway on the concept level it is activated. Yeah, and then it is processed from the cognitive input level. A binding process happens, so the relation type buffer is activated, and we get here for the word apple, we get the superordinate word fruit, and the word fruit is given to the output, to the cognitive output level, and then it passes the production pathway, so from concept to lemma to phonological form to motor form. Here we have again the same things. The associative memories work the same. The correct word is passed up down to the motor level. Here for the input the same. The correct phonological input apple is passed upwards to the concept level. But in addition, at each of these levels, the concepts and the phonological level, we have the co-activation of similar items for fruit, cereal, and nut, for apple, apricot, and peach. Yeah, and for example, here at the phonological level, for apple, we have another word, apacy, which starts with the same, with the same first syllable. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so again, we started with an auditory input. Upwards here, we generated a superordinate term and then produced the output. Third task, nonsense word or logatome repetition. It is important to state that in this case of logatomes, of nonsense words, we did not activate the lemma at the higher levels. We just stayed on the phonological level at the highest level. I will show that here. Now, so the priming was at least the same, but this is not modeled very detailed, so at least the priming in the case of this task is easier. It is just listen and reproduce in the first part. The second part is at least not necessary here for the control process. So what we get is an auditory input, and we see all the cognitive and the higher level lexical components are not activated. We just stay with the perceptual. From the auditory input, it gives an activation at the perception level, so the word truck is activated here, but it is not seen as a meaningful unit. It is just seen as a logatome, as a nonsense syllable here. So only we have a direct activation of the output buffer, of the phonological buffer on the production side. How does this work? That works in the way, because we have a shortcut here. I mentioned the internal paths, the internal loops earlier in my videos earlier. We have an internal phonological control loop here, but we have the vice versa pathway as well. So a phonological term in the perception pathway can activate the phonological buffer on the production pathway. This is an hypothesis which is modeled here in the model as well. So we get here a full activation and then get the motor form here. So we see from the perception side, we directly get this same activation on the production side, and we get the motor activation of that syllable as well. Okay, so in order to see that the model works correctly, we integrated neural dysfunctions. That can be done very easily and in a very defined way, because the model defines the functioning on each level, and so we can define or integrate dysfunctions in a very specific way. So here we will perform the same task, but now including lesions at different levels of the model. For example, on the phonological level, the phonological state buffers can be affected. That means that, this state buffer, that percentages of neurons within these state buffers are lesioned, are not working correctly. And that leads to Broca and Wernicke aphasia. So that means we implement we call it ablation of a percentage of neuron here in this buffer, which should lead to a Wernicke aphasia. The same on the production side, which would lead to a Broca aphasia. We can introduce lesions as well to associative memories, for example, between the phonological and the lemma levels on both sides, which would lead to transcortical motor or sensory aphasias. That means, please keep in mind that these arrows represent associative memories. If we introduce lesions, ablations to neurons in these buffers, we get this transcortical motor or transcortical sensory aphasia. Or we can add lesions to the associative memories between the lemma and concept buffer, which would lead to mixed aphasia. In this case, we do it directly on both sides. At this higher level, it is difficult to separate between the sides. So then we get this mixed type aphasia. And last but not least, we can introduce lesions to a pathway between both phonological buffers, which should which is the indication for a conduction aphasia. So we introduce lesions here. Yeah, and then we performed our simulations, and what we would like to see or what should occur is a decrease in task performance. And that are the symptoms for these different types of aphasia. So the results are summarized on these slides. So for each type of neural dysfunction leading to these types of aphasia, we really get a decrease in performance of one or more of the three tasks introduced earlier. So for the Broca aphasia, we of course get a decrease in production as well as in repetition, while comprehension works. In the case of Wernicke aphasia, production works, but comprehension as well as repetition is not working correctly. In the case of the transcortical motor aphasia, the production a task that means, yeah, the production, normal production task does not work. In the case of the transcortical sensory aphasia, the comprehension task does not work. In the case of mixed aphasia, both of these tasks does not work, while the repetition task, the low-level repetition task of syllables is not affected. Please keep in mind that the mixed aphasia is given here as a high-level type, not affecting these lower-level areas. And in the case of the conduction aphasia, more or less nothing is working because we just tested logatomes and not higher level performances. And in the case of this, if we have problems with the phonological to phonological pathway, at least the repetition task is affected as well. So that is not surprising, but the model, of course, is able to reproduce the correct behavior for each neural dysfunction modeled on the level of the architecture. So if we put a well-known dysfunction to a well-known functional a portion of the model to a well-known buffer, then we of course get these typical well-known dysfunctions or symptoms of this type of disorder, of this type of aphasia in this case. Okay, that's all for this video. In the next video, I will introduce more complex tasks and we will go on with the model. So thank you so far.